I think we are on schedule to get them out in the next. I think we should get them out in the next class on Monday. Okay, I think I have to restart my computer or something because I don't seem to have a mouse pointer. So if anyone's got anything entertaining to do while that happens.
I would if I was doing something.
What? You would what?
Just chit chat.
I don't want to know what that is.
Sir, extend the homework.
Can you say that again?
Can you extend the homework?
No, you had a fair bit of time for this homework and I'm getting bored of it. So,
It's lengthier.
huh?
It's lengthier.
Is it lengthier?
I think it's lengthy.
In what way?
In everything.
Yeah, but
It has more number of questions, more number of cards. and
No,
more
it has
number of
same number of
questions.
questions. So let me give you a, if you want to feel better, let me tell you something. When I was making your midterm, at least 2 out of the homework questions were actually supposed to be in your midterm.
That was a friend.
So I figured, especially the question about decision lists, I didn't want to put it in the midterm because I thought that would be a little cruel. But the homework is, fair game. So we are about knee deep or ankle deep in support vector machines, and we're going to continue where we left off. Good. So announcement again. We're going to you have a homework due on Monday, and like I said, you should be able to do at least half of it, and the rest of it you should be able to do it at the end of this class.
Do you know why they're called support vector machines?
Good question. We're going to answer that about 40 minutes from now. But as an aside, it has led to a very interesting machine learning joke. Outside CMU, there was a protest, the machine learning protest, where people were holding signs saying support vector machines. But that's not why they were called. So,
Let's do that.
yes. In fact, a lot of machine learning names tend themselves to signs and protests, like Bayesians against discrimination. Anyway, so at the end of the last class, we kind of came to, yes?
Where do we send the reports?
To, right, I'll set it up on Canvas. It's due, right, the intermediate report's due on April 1st, and it's going to be the same as your project proposal. It's not due today, it's due on April 1st.
Just accept it.
Since when?
It's not.
You should, the dates were updated on the website.
March 20.
Timeline. In the timeline, it's okay.
What?
In the timeline, it's updated. In the descriptions, it's
Oh, it's not? Okay. If you go to the lecture page, there's an update there. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Okay, so we ended the last lecture by looking at this general idea called regularized loss minimization. And the idea was to define something called a loss. A loss is a function that takes a hypothesis and an example, and it says it penalizes mistakes made by that particular hypothesis function on that example. And what seems like a sound idea is to find the hypothesis that minimizes loss on the training set. Now, if you just do that, we end up overfitting typically. So there's this other term in the other aspect called regularization. And the regularization is a function of, the regularizer is a function of hypotheses. and it imposes a preference over functions and says these functions are less complex and these functions are more complex. And we know that less complex functions are better, they generalize better. So the regularizer is a function that imposes a preference over hypothesis independent of any training data. And the loss is a function that imposes a preference over hypothesis with respect to a particular data training set. And regularized risk minimization frames learning as finding the hypothesis which minimizes the sum of these two things, the regularizer plus loss. Of course, we came to this by looking at a particular instance of this problem, which is SVM. Here, the regularizer term is W transpose W, and in the last class we saw that minimizing W transpose W is equivalent to maximizing the margin, and maximizing the margin gives us all these wonderful VC dimension properties. So this is one way of getting your regularizer. It turns out there are other ideas for it. There are other ways of thinking about regularization, and we'll see one more when we come to logistic regression. There's also a probabilistic interpretation of this. The loss for support vector machines is this function called the hinge loss, which is just the term inside the summation, the max part. And the hinge loss says try to find a weight vector that pushes for maximum correctness. And we saw this case of, we saw the example of how this also involves a slack term which allows the classifier to make mistakes. And this expression here says make mistakes on as few things as possible. Any questions about this? Oh, and there's a third term C which trades off between this, and we don't know what C is a priori. We try to find a good C that gets us a good overall classification accuracy. And in your homework you'll be optimizing this objective using an algorithm called stochastic gradient descent. We'll be looking at that today, stochastic subgradient descent in fact. And to find C, you'll have to implement a procedure called cross-validation. I won't be describing cross-validation in class, but it's described in the homework write-up, and you might, if you have questions, you should email the discussion group or just come to office hours. Any questions about the SVM objective? Have you solved the problem by writing down the objective? This is a declarative statement. It says the best weight vector is one that minimizes these things. Have we solved everything? Have we done all that we need to do? What's missing here?
Actually minimizing it?
Actually minimizing it. We don't have a learning algorithm, we just have a declarative statement saying I like weight vectors that minimize these things. And today's class we are going to actually try. My plan today is just to get to these two sections. First I'll talk about I'll present an algorithm for minimizing the SVM objective, and it's a rather easy to implement algorithm, and it has some interesting interpretations. And after that I'll talk about this question of why is this thing called a support vector machine, and that discussion will take us along to something called kernels, which lets us do build nonlinear classifiers. So just to remind you, this is the objective, and this function, the function that's being minimized as a function of W, is a convex function. How many people have seen convex functions before? How many people have not seen convex functions before? How many people have hands? Okay. Given that not everyone's seen convex function, it's probably good that I'll spend some time talking about it. I'm not going to give a very formal definition. I'll only give a formal definition. I'm not going to give too much information about convexity, because that's about 2 or 3 semesters of classes right there. But it's utterly fascinating, and I encourage you to read about it in your spare time for fun. So let's take a deep. In the simplest case, let's say you have a function f, and it's a function from some space to the rails. F is said to be a convex function if this property is satisfied. It's just an equation, and But let's try to interpret it. If you have two input points u and v, and you have a lambda, and the lambda lets you find a new input which is an interpolation of u and v. So lambda u plus 1 minus lambda v. Okay, that's the left hand side, and you take the function value at that interpolated point. What that means is you're trying to take the function value anywhere along between these 2 points. F is said to be convex if the function value at this interpolated point is less than the value of the actual interpolation of the function values at u and v, which means it's lambda times f of u plus 1 minus lambda times f of v should be more than the function value at any point in between. Now, the one way to interpret this is to say that if you find any 2 points, you can think of the function as a graph. If you find any 2 points on the graph and you draw a line joining them, that line should lie completely above the function. Like the chord is above the blue curve. Another way of interpreting this, and this is interesting and also leads to some a generalized definition, is the tangent at any point lies below the function. Okay? Now, if this is true for every point, then the function is said to be convex. Now, in 2 dimensions, I can think of a tangent line. In 3 dimensions, I can think of a tangent plane. In n dimensions, the generalization is hyperplane, a tangent hyperplane. So the tangent hyperplane lies below the function. That's another, this is an if and only if statement actually. For every point, the tangent lies below the function. Now, just as an example, some functions are convex, linear lines are convex, because the tangent of point is the line itself. F of x is x square is convex. Max is a convex function in 3 dimensions. You can, all these kind of paraboloids are convex if you have positive coefficients to the square terms. How do you show that functions are convex? One way to do that is to actually apply the definition. You actually consider arbitrary inputs u and v and prove that f of lambda u plus 1 minus lambda v is less than or equal to lambda f of u plus 1 minus lambda f of v. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing proving that a function is convex is to take the second derivative of it. If the function is a scalar function, meaning it goes from r to r, and the second derivative is always positive, then the function is convex. So f of x is x square, the second derivative is 2, which is always positive, so x square is a convex function. For vector valued functions, you need to prove that the derivative is no longer the derivative is actually a Hessian, it's a matrix, and you need to prove that the matrix is a positive semi-definite matrix. If you are wondering what a positive semi-definite matrix is, I would suggest you look at homework 0. It doesn't matter because I'm not going to ask you to prove what functions are convex, or maybe I will, I don't know. The point is, I want you to get this understanding of what a convex function is. The tangent lies below the function. A very loose way of saying this is a convex function look like a cup.
What is the definition for the convex function in 3 dimensions?
In 3 dimensions, it's the same definition. In 3 dimensions, u and v will be vectors. I can still take convex combinations of vectors, and everything is the same. So this definition, I have cleverly not told you what the domain is, so that I can make it more general. Again, this is also a somewhat restricted definition. There are more rigorous ways of writing this down. Okay, not all functions are convex. Here are just some squiggles that are not convex. There are some classes of functions which are purely concave, which is the inequality sign gets reversed. And one way of getting concave functions is just to take negations. The interesting thing is lines are both convex and concave functions. And some functions are neither convex nor concave, because in all those things the tangent will pass through the function sometimes. This is fun, I hope. But the more relevant point is that convex functions are actually really very useful things to understand, because everything we know about optimization is provable. It turns out almost everything we know about optimization is provable only for convex functions. In particular, you know that if you have any arbitrary function, when the derivative of the function reaches 0, you have a local minimum. This is calculus 101, which you probably did in 3rd grade. But for convex functions, this condition is both necessary and sufficient. Which means, if you find a point which has a 0 derivative, then you're guaranteed that that point is the global minimizer of that function. Which means, in other words, there's only one minimum. Okay, so which is why optimization has been studied for convex functions, because theorems are somewhat easier to prove. And there's like a huge body of work on. In fact, probably one of the best resources for reading about convex functions is a book called Convex Optimization by Boyd and Vanderbilt. And I think Stephen Boyd also has really excellent slides which introduce these ideas. So, as far as we are concerned, if we have an objective that's convex, then life is good, because we can throw in any convex optimization algorithm at our objective, and learning is done. So that's good. The other point is, if we invent a new algorithm, or we can take lessons from convex optimization to invent new algorithms and optimize it for our specific objective. Questions about convex functions or convexity? Okay. So in particular, as I mentioned, SVM objective is convex. It's a quadratic function. Quadratic is like, basically this is a sum of square terms, and we know squares are convex. I hinted that max is convex, sum of two convex functions is convex, so this whole thing is convex. That's how you prove that this is convex. But so you can frame this as a quadratic optimization problem. QP, it's called quadratic programming. QP has been studied forever now, and first wheel was invented, and then fire, and then quadratic programming. That's how old it is. But the weird thing about this particular objective, and also a lot of learning objectives that you'll see, is standard QP methods don't seem to work too well, because you're guaranteed that you'll get to a minimum, but they're slow. They don't take advantage of the specific structure of this particular objective. The fact that it's a summation of many, many things. So if you have this summation, I is over the training set. And since we live in the world of big data, this training set could be millions of examples, and it does not take advantage of the fact that this is this clean, interesting numeric form. So standard QP solvers, the older methods for SVM use gradient descent. Now gradient descent is guaranteed to work for convex functions because, as I said, a convex function looks like a cup, and you start anywhere, you go down the gradient, you're guaranteed to come to the bottom. That's pretty much the intuition behind gradient descent. And gradient descent can, we can write down gradient descent. We've seen gradient descent before when we were talking about linear regression. I hope you remember. This is just roughly you must have seen, this slide must look familiar. Say we have an objective function j of w. In our case, that's the function. We're trying to minimize it. We start with some initial guess, find the gradient at that point, and go in the opposite direction. Keep doing this till you eventually come to some bottom. and you're done. If you have a quadratic function, you can even prove that you can even find the number of steps you have. For all these other functions like that one there, things get slightly more complicated. So you have to iterate. This is an iterative algorithm. You do one gradient step every time. And the intuition behind this is the gradient is the direction of the steepest increase of the function, and we want to go in the opposite direction. So gradient descent for SVM, and this is actually the same slide that I had before. I just changed the definition of J. You compute the gradient of J at every time step. You start off with some W naught, you compute the gradient at some time step, and do gradient descent. Gradient descent is an extremely popular algorithm, and also reminds me of another machine learning joke. At some conference, there was a person who said the most popular algorithm in machine learning is graduate student descent, where a graduate student tries out one thing, it doesn't work, and then optimizes it, tries out another thing, it doesn't work. Then he realized that graduate student descent is very depressing. So he renamed it to graduate student ascent. It's hill climbing in a concave function. In any case, gradient descent is a popular method. So what's the problem here? Well, are we done? I mean, we have a convex function, we can write down the gradient of J. Can we write down the gradient of J?
It's not differentiable.
It's not differentiable, but that's the second problem. That will be your answer when I ask the same question in about 3 minutes. The gradient of this function is, it turns out, it requires you to sum over the entire training set for doing one update. Just to make one update to your weight vector, you need to sum over your entire training set, and you're not done. And then you make another update. It turns out this method is ridiculously slow, and nobody uses this because of the fact that it's slow. It doesn't scale to the fact that you have practically infinite data. So the answer to that is something called stochastic gradient descent, which conveniently fills up a slide. It's this following strategy. You start with some initial weight vector, 0 or random or whatever. Initialization does not matter because this function is convex. Because it's a convex function, you can start anywhere you want. You can start at 0, then you can prove interesting things. And you iterate over you do the following step multiple times. First, you pick a random training example. Pretend that that training example is your entire training data set, and write down an objective, a same objective, using that training example. So you get something like this. You don't sum over thing because the summation is just one term. Compute the gradient of this objective and take a gradient step. Then again, pick another random example, or maybe the same random example. Just pick a random example. Pretend that that is the entire training set. Take another gradient step. This is called stochastic gradient descent because if you iterate this n times, or if you do this sufficient number of times, in expectation you would have computed the gradient, the full gradient. And that's really how the proof for this algorithms go. And I think I've posted a link on the website about stochastic gradient descent if you're interested in reading about this. If I have not posted it, somebody send me an email. Yes?
So when you say random pick, can you pick the same item twice?
Yeah, you could. I mean, it's randomly with replacement. This is the version of the algorithm that is analyzed typically. In a few slides, I'm going to have a slight variant of this algorithm, which is the one that you will implement, which forces you to go through the entire training set and not pick the same thing again. And this latter strategy has slightly empirically works better. It just so happens. So this algorithm is guaranteed to converge in expectation. With high probability, you will get to the bottom of the function as you iterate this for longer duration. And the proof for that basically relies on the fact that this is a convex function. This works only for stochastic gradient descent will converge to the bottom minimum if you have a convex function. So now you ask me a question. Ask me a question.
Was the bound on T, capital T?
It's a function of t. But before getting to the question, here's a picture that I pulled from one of Andrew Ng's talks, which gives you a sort of a vague intuition of what's the difference between gradient descent and stochastic gradient descent. The stochastic gradient descent algorithm estimates the gradient at every point, and it may be a bad direction. So gradient descent roughly makes a smoothish path to the bottom. This is a contour plot of the function. Whereas stochastic gradient descent moves around quite a bit. But eventually, in expectation, you're guaranteed to get to the bottom. Okay?
How long do we have to walk?
How long do you have to do that? The theorem says at infinity you'll get to the bottom. But that's kind of a mean, that's neither here nor there. In practice, what you do is you keep track of the objective value. In practice, there are two differences that you do. First, instead of randomly picking a training point, what you do is you first shuffle your entire training data and iterate over it fully. And then shuffle your training data, iterate over it fully. And after each complete iteration, you compute the SVM objective and you keep track of how much the difference is. And if the differences are negligible, you call it done.
So in the practical scenario, what has been the...
So I use SGD a lot, and about 20 iterations over the training data. And some people say 5 is a good number. I don't know why. I mean, usually it's a very small number. And this algorithm also has some interesting parallelization properties. There are many fun things to talk about this algorithm. Unfortunately, we are not going to have time about that. But I encourage you to read about this. So, the only question that's left is, I have a function which is the jt, which is this function here, and I need to compute the gradient of this with respect to w. And now the question comes up, this is not a differentiable function because max is not differentiable. It's continuous, but not differentiable. So, we are kind of stuck. Gradient descent is not the answer. Okay? That takes us to this another detour about something called subgradients. Subgradients are not smaller gradients. It's a generalization of the idea of a gradient to non-differentiable functions. I mentioned that, and this has a formal definition that's coming up, but let's try to think about it. A tangent line has a one-to-one mapping with the gradient at that point. So the slope of the tangent is the gradient of that function. And a tangent is a function that is a line that lies below the function and touches the function at that point. I can think of this thing called a subtangent. I don't think this is always this word is always used, but let's think of something called a subtangent, which is any line that touches the function at that point and is otherwise completely below the function. If the function is differentiable, at any point there can be exactly one subtangent. A subgradient is a set of slopes of these functions. Let's look at a formal definition. A subgradient of a function f at a point x is g is a vector g if the following property is satisfied. For all other points other than that point x, f of y is greater than or equal to, or include even at x, it doesn't matter. F of y is greater than or equal to, the function is always above the line at that point. What's the line? F of x plus g transpose x minus or y minus x. So this is a picture from Stephen Boyd's slides, and some random function f which has this one point where it's not differentiable. At all other points the function is differentiable, in particular at x1 it is, and the subgradient at that point is g1. It's also the gradient because it's the equation of this line is a tangent and the slope of that is g1, and we are good. There's nothing new about these points where the function is differentiable. The interesting part, or the new part, is at that point where it's not differentiable, I can draw multiple lines which have this property. Here there are two lines, with slope g2 and g3. I can draw multiple lines that lie below the function and pass through that point. So if you have a function that is, for example, like this, like a v, this is f of x, is the absolute value of x. A function that looks like a v. At all points that are not 0, the gradient is well defined. The gradient is the slope of that line. At this point, I define the following subtangents. This line is a subtangent, a line that goes through but is below. This line is another subtangent. This line is another subtangent. Basically, this whole collection of lines that are below but pass through the point are the collection of subtangents, and that's the formal definition. And the set, that entire set of slopes, are called the subgradients. Questions? And again, if I need to turn the board for you guys, let me know. If you've never seen this before, this might seem a bit odd, the idea of defining gradients for non-differentiable functions. But, and I'm not going to ask you to start computing subgradients for arbitrary functions. The one that we care about has this max in it. Max is the source of problems for us. And the general strategy for getting a subgradient for this is first, you are at a point, at some point, you want to find a subgradient at some point. First, solve the max at that point. Okay, compute the value of the max and pretend that the entire function is coming from that max, from whatever is maximizing it. So if max is 0, then that term will disappear. So you have something like this. So you have half that's something like this. First I solve the max for this, which means that if y w transpose x is greater than 1, then the max will be 0. Otherwise, it is 1 minus y w transpose x. Right? Plus, the rest of it still remains. I can unroll the max and define it this way. I take now I have differentiable functions in both places. I take the derivative in both cases and you get what's there. So in this case it's just w, it's a square, so the derivative of a square is just w, and in this case it's w plus or w minus cyx. Make sense?
I have a question.
defining a gradient, what is it a function?
G is a vector. The gradient is always a vector. It's a direction.
So that's G transpose multiplied by minus.
G transpose, it's a dot product, yeah. It's G dot y minus x. And if G is a scalar, then it's just product.
That notation makes it look like a function. That's why
Which one?
G transpose of minus.
Oh, really? Okay, I should probably mention that G is a vector. Yeah.
So, how do we select which subgradient to use? Is
Good
that-
question. There are many subgradients, right?
Yeah.
It turns out, for proving that the optimization part, it doesn't matter. You can take any subgradient and descend, and if your function has certain nice properties, you're okay. So that's really the algorithm. So this is a gradient, subgradient, and now we have everything we need to write down the full algorithm. And I'm going to encourage you to go over these slides once again and convince yourself that I'm not cheating you out of anything. Because on one hand, this might seem ridiculously simple, because I have a function that's shaped like a bowl. To get to the bottom, I can start anywhere and go down the gradient. But then there are two interesting tweaks that we have done. We have gone from gradients to stochastic gradients, and we've gone from stochastic gradients to stochastic subgradients. Stochastic gradient descent is probably one of the most popular machine learning algorithms, because a popular paradigm in machine learning, I hate the word paradigm, a popular strategy in machine learning is to write down your learning objective function to say that this is a quality that I want to minimize, this is some property of my hypothesis I want to minimize, and then offload the problem of minimization to an optimization algorithm. And typically the easiest optimization algorithm that you can write is stochastic gradient or subgradient descent. So it's an important important thing to understand. But even if you didn't understand it, you can still see an algorithm. And this was the variant that I mentioned, where you, instead of randomly picking a point, you iterate multiple times over the data. So the algorithm is rather simple. Remember that the gradient looks like that. So what you do is you first initialize your weight vector, and then you iterate over the training data multiple times. At each time, each iteration, you take an example and compute its subgradient and take the subgradient step. Or equivalently, you check for these two conditions. If this is true, if y w transpose x is less than 1, then your update looks like this. You first, let's consider this case. Let's consider the top. Y w transpose x is greater than 1. Then what you do is you just scale the w top. So w is w times 1 minus r. You make w smaller. This is called shrinking. Now why is this a good thing? This means in the absence of any other information, our objective has a square term, and scaling the w down will bring down the regularizer, the value of the regularizer. So shrinking leads to generalization. On the other hand, if you made a mistake, notice that this condition is for checking for mistakes. Y w transpose x is less than 1. If you made a mistake, if you've not made any mistakes, you still update your w by shrinking. If you made a mistake, you first shrink your w and then take an update in the direction of y times x. Because of this term here, because of the y dot y, because the gradient looks like cyx. Yes.
R is just a learning rate hyperparameter.
R is a learning rate, and I'll talk about that. And the learning rate for this to work needs to satisfy certain properties. And it's rather simple to make this satisfy those properties. So I'll talk about that. It's basically a step size. You can think of it as a step size. And one intuitive property that you might want R to satisfy is the step size is too large, the objective will bounce around a lot. So you don't want the step size to be large. And if the step size remains consistently large, it will never get to the bottom because you keep moving around. So step size should, in practice, should keep decreasing, so that as you're getting closer and closer to the bottom, you want to take smaller steps. So yeah, so R is the learning rate, and there are many different ways of tweaking learning rates, and I'm going to mention only one of them, and maybe just hint at another one. Another important point is that it's very important to shuffle the examples before you get into this loop. In practice, that makes a big difference. Okay? Questions?
Where did the less than or equal 1 come from? Where is the 1 coming from?
From the one here. When you are solving for the max, right? Now let's kind of, that's a good point. Let's analyze this, this update. Really, the rest of it is scaffolding. This is the only interesting part of the algorithm. If yw.x is less than 0, then you made a mistake. We've seen this from the beginning of the semester. If yw.x is less than 0, then you made a mistake. It makes sense to update the weight vector.
Less than 0 or less than 1?
Less than 0. Here, it's less than 1. So if yw.x is greater than 0, your w is not making a mistake, but still if it's less than 1, you are forcing an update. And the reason for that is if it is greater than 0 but less than 1, that means geometrically that point lies within the margin. And you want to maximize the margin. You want to push points away from the margin, so you're still making an update. So there are three regimes here. One, when there's no mistake, yw.x is greater than 1, then all you do is shrink. Two, yw.x is less than 0, a mistake, clearly update the weight vector towards the towards yx. This in between region, between 0 and 1. That means that the point is inside the margin for the current weight vector, so try to push it away. So it's this gives you a very good interpretation, an intuitive interpretation of the stochastics updated descent algorithm. To answer your question, but go ahead.
I didn't get it. So, my question, you're maximizing 1 minus 0, 1 minus
Right.
y, this expression. So, when a mistake happens in this case, when are we assuming a mistake has happened?
What do you mean?
So you are saying, right, if y wdx, this expression is less than or equal to 1. Is this a mistake or not a mistake? It's a mistake.
It's not. I don't want to call it a mistake or not a mistake. A mistake is always yw.x is less than 0. Because that's how we predict.
Yeah, that's how we predict, but I thought we assumed that in this case.
In this case, we are penalizing weight vectors even if they don't make a mistake, but they put points inside the margin. This which is really what's going on. Support vector machines try to maximize the margin, and this is how they do it. I mean, this is how this algorithm does it. It depends if you derive a different optimization algorithm. Typically, all of them have intuitive explanations for why it maximizes the margin. To answer the question about the convergence of this algorithm and learning rate, there are some. You don't have to necessarily understand all of this, but for those of you who do, if your learning rates, and here in this algorithm I've just written R as a constant. What you typically do is it's R sub t, where t is the number. T is not the epoch ID, but you just start a counter t equals 0 here, and you increase t every time you see a new example. T is the example ID. Every time you see an example, you increase t, and learning rate changes every time you see a new example. And so it's RT, and this for reasons that I'm not going to get into, I'm calling it gamma here. You need your gamma t's to have the following properties. Intuitively, you don't want them to be really large, because really large steps will make the algorithm bounce around and never get to the bottom. Formally, all the gammas have to be positive, they have to sum to infinity. If some sigma gamma t from t equals 0 to infinity should be infinite, but the squares should be finite. So this is called it's square summable but not summable. Intuitively, what this means is the gamma should be less than 1, among other things. Practically, one learning rate that has been found to be useful is this one here, and you might want to try this out in your homework. You pick a certain gamma naught. How do you pick that? You just divine inspiration strikes you, and then the gamma t you write it this way as a function of gamma naught and c. C is that parameter that came up in the SVM definition, and this tends to work. And yes.
So I have a question about the little t. Are we resetting little t to 0 at each epoch?
No, you're not. You're not. T is never reset.
Just
Yes, t can potentially go to infinity. It's a good question. Yes, it's not clear from what I said. Yeah. So just to clarify, t is never reset here. T is set to initialize outside the outermost loop and incremented every time here. Okay. Yeah, so just a little bit of formal notation. The comparison between gradient descent and stochastic gradient descent. I told you that gradient descent is slow, but how slow? It turns out gradient descent for something like SVM, the convergence to within epsilon of the best value of the objective is O of n, roughly. Whereas stochastic gradient descent has this amazing property that you can get to within epsilon of the best objective as a function that's independent of the size of the training data. Now think about this. I'm giving you a learning algorithm whose convergence property, it can get to arbitrarily close, arbitrarily good weight vectors, and it doesn't matter how big your data is, because if the convergence is not a function of the size of the data. And this is, in fact, I think this was actually an excellent paper, excellent series of work that roughly could be subtitled as "More Data Implies Less Work." And in fact, that was the title of the talk. And in general, if you have huge data sets, you probably want stochastic gradient descent. Okay, another observation. This is does it look familiar? What does it look like?
Linear classifier look like
Perceptron.
or that the motion is also winning.
No, but it's an additive update rule. In fact, let's look at the perceptron update rule. The perceptron update does not have an else here. This becomes 0, and this term disappears. This disappears. So the perceptron update will make an update. The perceptron algorithm will make an update only if there's a mistake. SVM will make or SGD for SVM will make an update even if there's no mistake but the point is within the margin. The perceptron update does not have shrinkage, whereas this one does. Now, it turns out this similarity is not entirely coincidental, and I'll let you prove this for yourself. The perceptron can be reinterpreted as minimizing something called the perceptron loss and doing stochastic subgradient descent on the perceptron loss without any regularizer. SVM optimizes the SVM loss or the hinge loss and has a regularizer. Remember that the regularizer has the property of improving generalization. The perceptron does not have that, and the way to inject generalization into perceptron is by using average perceptron. SVM gets generalization through the regularizer. So this is a very neat convergence of ideas. We started off perceptron just, I think, 1950s. Rosenblatt just gave an algorithm. The algorithm just came to him, he wrote it down, and it has this 1960s, there was a mistake bound. And now we know that perceptron is also basically stochastic subgradient descent. It fits into this loss minimization philosophy. It's not regularized loss minimization, it's just loss minimization. Let's sum up the optimization bits of SVM. Just to mention this again, SVM minimizes regularized hinge loss. And I talked about one algorithm for minimization, which is stochastic subgradient descent. It's super fast. Runtime doesn't depend on the size of the data. And I want you to compare this with perceptron mentally. Think about what the differences are. Think about why these differences are actually meaningful and what they do to the final weight vector. In fact, for your homework, you'll be implementing stochastic subgradient descent. And the reason I think it should not be terribly hard is because you've already implemented perceptron, and the number of characters you need to change in the code is rather small. So the edit distance is really low. You just copy the file, rename it as SVM, and start making tweaks. And get rid of averaging. And there's a C term that becomes an input to the program. And the other, I also want to point out that stochastic gradient descent or stochastic subgradient descent is not the only way of optimizing SVM. Probably the first algorithm for SVM was an algorithm, or one of the first was something called SMO, sequential minimum optimization. I never get it's SMO. And it's a much slower algorithm. More recently, there's another algorithm, when I say recent, I mean mid-2000s, another algorithm called coordinate descent in the dual. And I'm not going to talk about it at all because it's going to take at least 2 whiteboards of proof to derive it. It turns out and this particular method is implemented in a really popular package called liblinear, and that usually is my default if I want to run some quick experiments on data to get some sanity check, because liblinear is super optimized across many different machines. Questions about the optimization?
What is the stochastic part of the algorithm?
The stochastic part of the algorithm, here it doesn't look like stochastic. The stochastic bit comes in here because you're shuffling. But in this version, there's you pick a random example. And when I want you to do this offline, I want you to compare this one with the other version because they are subtly different. All the proofs that I mentioned, the guarantee of convergence is for this one. In practice, the other one does better, slightly better. Yes?
So I have a question. So generally, we have a slack parameter, right, which is greater than or equal to 0 for negative examples, or for
the label never shows up in the slack. It's greater than or equal to 0 for all examples.
for all examples, even
Yes.
if those are not possible.
Yes.
But we assign each input a different slack parameter, right?
Yes. Every example gets a different slack. Yes.
So do we update our weight vector if there's no mistake?
Yes, you do. If there's no mistake, you make your weight vector smaller.
So it's only change the scalar value of the weight vector, right?
You should what?
It's only change
The norm of the weight vector.
yeah.
It reduces the norm of the weight vector because r is less than 1. So 1 minus r is less than 1. So the norm goes down by r squared roughly.
Okay, is the normal important?
Yes, the norm is important because this is the first term in the objective. We want to minimize this entire thing. Or actually, this is some sigma here. we want to minimize this term, right? If I make the norm smaller, this goes down. This guy was 0 because if there's no mistake, if the yw.x is less than 0, this term will be 0 for that example, but for that example you bring down the norm. Overall, we want this entire thing to be minimized. Other questions?
We use same C value for the trend. We don't change once we fix the C.
You fix the C. C is a single. C is the only hyperparameter here. Actually, no. C and gamma naught, the initial learning rate, are the two hyperparameters. Yes.
We were talking about linearly separable data and
This
convexity.
This doesn't assume linearly separable data. This is for any arbitrary data. If the data is not linearly separable, this will do a best effort.
That's what the C term was.
That's what the entire left-hand term is.
So when we're talking about convexity, we're talking about the SVM equation.
That is convex. That whole
needs to be
function.
convex.
That is convex. Yes.
And that's why the gradient descent works.
Yes. Yes. If the function is not convex, gradient descent does not guarantee you global minimum. Yes.
Is it the regularization term that allows SVM to work with non-separable data?
No,
where
it's the other term.
perceptron gets stuck?
It's the loss term.
But you said that perceptron can be viewed like SVM, but so it's a different loss and no regularization, and
So
perceptron gets stuck on
the
non-separable data.
Right, even so, that's a good observation. Perceptron gets stuck on non-separable data for the, I don't know what exactly, I have to think about this, so I don't want to think about it right now. But that's a good question. I think it's not the regularization that makes a difference. The regularization guarantees generalization. Remember that for perceptron, the mistake bound theorem only says you'll not make any more mistakes. It does not say how well you'll do on future data.
But can the, if you don't want to answer this right now, it's also fine, but can that sort of, does that sort of seem like the problem where when the data isn't linearly separable because it's sort of trying to overfit, it's trying to find the best solution?
Yeah, even here, you can think of the data as being not linearly separable for two reasons. One, the true concept is not linear. Or two, it's noise. You want to get rid of the noise, which is what this thing is doing. Potentially, this also, it's possible that it's not linearly separable because the data is not linearly separable. And in that case, what it will do is it will try to throw away as many points as it can to get the linearly separable form. So yeah, there's a trade-off here. If you believe your data is not linearly separable, this is still an objective function. You can still minimize it. You might not get a good function. Yeah.
In this example you said, so we update when we have a example between the
Right.
close to the plane, or it is a.
Yeah.
So what I'm asking is, how does this value C adjust the overfitting and underfitting parameter? Like
See, to see why that happens, you need to look at the objective. Don't look at the algorithm. Look at the objective. Now, if C is very low, C is 0, this entire term disappears. It doesn't. That means the entire this is the only part of the objective that involves the training data, right? So basically, the influence of the training data is completely lost. You underfit because you will pick W equals 0. On the other hand, if C is infinity or very high, this becomes less influential because I'm minimizing this and I really care about this part to be low. So you tend to overfit. This is why C trades off between over and underfitting.
I think you said earlier there was an optimization for this where you can check how much has changed in between epochs.
Oh yeah. So what I mentioned was not an optimization, a convergence criterion. Here, the way I've written it, you pick a number of steps, number of epochs, t. Instead of that, I can let this run forever. After I do this entire loop over the training data, here I compute the value of the objective, and I compare it to the previous time I computed the value of the objective. And if that difference is low enough, you call it, you quit. it turns out this function, I can keep talking about this for a long time, so I'm going to stop right after this. This particular algorithm, stochastic gradient descent, does not necessarily always decrease the objective. It could occasionally increase it because it's stochastic. The steps are jagged. So it's possible that it might go up, might go down, but if the absolute value does not change much, you can call it quits. Okay, I'm going to stop now. I want you to go over these slides and then come back if there are other questions. And move to why these things are called support vector machines, and then talk about kernels. So it's going to take us on a slightly different, a bit of a detour, and a brownie point for anyone who can tell me where this comes from. Yes, you know the answer. If you raise your hand, you know the answer. Anyway, so what we've seen is we've seen support vector machines, we've seen hinge laws, we've talked about optimizing the laws and all that. And more broadly, for pretty much a large part of the semester, we've been talking about linear classifiers. The question is, what about nonlinear models? What if your data is not linearly separable? And we've seen some hints as what we can do. What can we do?
Go to a higher dimension.
Sorry?
Go to a higher dimension.
Go to a higher dimension. Well, not go to any arbitrary higher dimension, but create a mapping. So you explicitly introduce a nonlinearity. So if your data looks like this, and your separator, let's say, if the true separator is quadratic, then you might want to introduce a mapping like this. And any quadratic function would be linear in terms of these things. And this is the standard trick that people use also for using linear regression when you want to fit nonlinear models. Just introduce something called the lifting map. Blow up the dimensionality, blow up the feature space. And so you try to find a weight vector in the higher dimensional space, and you predict. And we know how to find weight vectors in any dimensional spaces because we've seen multiple algorithms for this. And you predict as a positive if your W dot features in the new space is greater than some threshold. But the features in new space requires you to apply the lifting map for the new example as well. And I've introduced this idea multiple times in somewhat slightly different ways, and I made you think about this for one of your homeworks as well. The idea fundamentally is that we have algorithms that can learn linear classifiers. Can we use them to learn nonlinear classifiers? But let's just put this aside for a minute and think about what the SVM algorithm is doing. We've seen this objective before, and I'm not going to get into any details about optimization theory. Those of you who've seen it might recognize it when I say that this is in the primal form. And for primal objectives, there are also another optimization. For a primal problem, you can define something called a dual problem, and the standard theorems say that you can either minimize the primal or maximize the dual. You'll get to the same answer, and the answer is, you've got to the answer when primal equals dual. If you don't understand it, it doesn't matter. All I want you to know is that there exists something called dual forms for optimization problems. But knowing about this existence, and again, I'm not going to prove this, I'm only going to state the following property. It turns out for SVM, going through the duals and coming back lets you prove that if W, some W, is the minimizer for this objective, then it has the following really neat property. If you have m training examples, x1, y1, x2, y2, and so on till xm, ym, you introduce one alpha, a positive alpha for every, there exists an alpha for every training example, such that the true W, the best W, has this property. It's a linear combination of yi xi. In fact, it's more than a linear combination, it's a conic combination because alphas are positive. this is a property that holds true only at the minimum. Only when the W has gotten to the minimum of the objective. Furthermore, there are some more interesting properties. These alphas, you have one alpha for every example, right? For every example, I can compute the value of y w transpose x. If that ends up being more than 1, in other words, points outside the margins, these points and these pluses here, for those points, the corresponding alpha will be 0. For points that are on the wrong side of the margin, these alphas will be C that showed up.
I didn't understand the first equation. The first
This one?
W is equal to sigma into A.
This one.
Yeah.
This is just a property that holds true at the optimum. W will be a linear combination of yi, xi, of your entire training set. It's just a property. And there's a way of proving this, but for now let's pretend that this is true. And this is true. Furthermore, you can also, the conditions for optimality will also let us prove that some of these alphas will be many of these alphas will be 0. Many of these alphas will be 0 in the sense that all points that lie outside the margin and are correctly classified, if yw dot x is greater than 1, those points will have alpha equals 0. For points that lie on the wrong side of the margin, the y will be c. So these are those 2 points. And for points that lie on the margin, the alpha will be some number between 0 and c. Doesn't matter what. I mean, it does matter what, but it will. Or we can say that it will be a number between 0 and c. Okay. Now, this is a rather interesting property because what this means is that this weight vector is defined because the weight vector is alpha I times yx. When some of the alphas are 0, then these are the only 2 kinds of points that completely define the weight vector. What are these points? These are points that lie on the wrong side of the margin for these, or points that are within them, or points that are on the margin. Points that are on the right side of the margin don't influence the weight vector at all. So these points that are for which alphas are non-zero are called support vectors. They define the weight vector. So when the alphas are not 0, these data points are called support vectors. So all you need to know, instead of storing the weight vector, you can just store your training points whose alphas are non-zero, and you can reconstruct the weight vector because of this property. Okay? But that also lets us do some interesting analysis of this. So notice that, first of all, this is just an observation. Alphas ends up, a small set of data points define your model. In addition, the fact that W equals alpha yx lets us do some fun things. Remember that the prediction for a new example x that we've never seen, prediction is sine of W dot x. But the W is that summation, so I just replace this and you get this W dot x equals sum over all your training points, or sum over all the support vectors actually, of alpha yi xi transpose x, because the summation shows up. So really the only thing that matters is, for being able to make a prediction, is for you to take dot products between training examples and new examples. There's no such thing called a weight vector. All you have, effectively, are dot products between training examples and new examples. Okay? Does it make sense? Now let's think about the lifting map again. If I had blown up the feature space to some phi of x, W dot phi of x, to compute the score in the lifted space, all you need is a dot product in the higher dimensional space. Same idea. Okay? So let's rewrite this. So I have this function here, phi of xi times phi of x. So xi is a trailing point, x is a new point. Let's give a name for that dot product, and let's call it a kernel. A dot product in a higher dimensional space, I'm going to call it a kernel. K of, it's a function that takes two vectors and computes their dot product in some space. K of xz is phi of x transpose phi of z, and now I can write the prediction for my linear, the linear classifier for SVM as this thing here. You first find the kernel value for all your support vectors and scale them. Add them up, look at the sign of that, and that gives you the prediction. Because K of x is phi of x phi of z, and so far I've done just algebra. This function K is called a kernel, and we're going to look at some interesting properties of kernels right now. So before that, have we gained anything? I mean, I've just written a lot of new notation and introduced some algebra and say that w dot phi of x is equal to sum over this thing, sum over linear combination of kernel values. If I'm going to compute kernel value by actually blowing up the feature space and computing phi, I've really gained nothing. Now, what would be cool is if we can compute k of x and z, or xy, xi and x, without actually blowing up the feature space, remaining in the lower dimensional space, and get the dot product in a higher dimensional space. That will give us some computational advantage. And this is the kernel trick. So let me give you an example of how that by construction, prove by construction that this can be done. Let's take a polynomial, in fact quadratic. Say you have two vectors, x and z, and at this point the game is how do we compute k of x comma z without explicitly computing the feature representation, without explicitly computing the blown up feature space. So one way of doing that, this is the explicit version. So suppose I define phi of this x, I've just written this whole thing as a vector here, vector, as I've written all the elements. Phi of x is this n square dimensional vector which has all degrees 0, 1 and 2 terms. Actually not all, only certain squares. And I write down something called A, which is a dot product in the high dimensional space. It takes time and I don't want to do it. Instead I define a new function K, which is simply this term here, 1 plus dot product in the lower dimensional space square. Now I'm going to leave proof of this as an exercise. It turns out that A equals B up to some constants. And to prove that, all you need to do is just take the square and write it out explicitly. Take the dot product and write the dot product as a summation and write down the square, and you'll see that it's exactly that, except for some constants. So here's the way, if this is called a polynomial kernel, here's a way of computing a dot product in the quadratic space without actually going to the quadratic space. Okay? In general, this idea is called the kernel trick. And the question is, in the last, say, 2 minutes, I'm going to talk about what makes a function a kernel. Can any function that takes two vectors and produces a number be a kernel? It turns out it's not. Because a kernel is only a function that can be a dot product in some high dimensional space. So I can't just write a function and say this is my kernel. So I need to prove that something is a kernel. And you can do things with gram matrices. I'm going to skip this because you can look at it later. Let's look at some examples of kernels. Linear functions are kernels because the dot product in lower dimensional space is a dot product. We've just seen that a polynomial of degree d is a kernel. You can write this in two different ways. You can write, there are things called polynomial kernels. And suppose I have two functions which are known to be kernels, I can create new kernels. Multiplying by a constant gives you a kernel. Multiplying the kernel by a constant gives you a kernel. Applying the same function to both input points and multiplying them gives you a kernel. Applying a polynomial on top of a kernel gives you a kernel. exponentiating a kernel is a kernel. These are just properties, and I'm just listing them. You will need these to actually solve one of your homework questions even. Adding two kernels gives you a kernel. Multiplying two kernels gives you a kernel. And there are a few other things. This is a kernel that you will probably see a lot in the literature, something called an RBF kernel, which says given two data points, x and z, you take the Euclidean distance of them, scale it, and exponentiate it. Basically, pretend that your data comes from a Gaussian. And this kernel, this function is also a kernel because you have a polynomial. Remember that exponentiating gives you a kernel, gives you a kernel, and polynomials are kernels. So that's what's going on here. You take a polynomial and then exponentiate it. RBF kernels are very widely used in the context of, I've seen this a lot in computer vision and such things. Question?
Does it matter if our kernels are symmetric or not?
They are symmetric and positive semi-definite. They have to be. Now, as an exercise, I want you to prove that this is a kernel. And more importantly, I want you to think about, I told you that the kernel represents a dot product in some higher dimensional space. I want you to think about what is the higher dimensional space in which this guy is a dot product. Hint, it's not a finite dimensional space. The dimensionality is infinite. And I'm going to skip this example right now because we are running out of time, and we'll start here in the next lecture. And if there are questions, I'll remain here. Otherwise, I'll see you on Monday.